Hello and welcome to Think Tank number 7, the value of Latin America for air vehicle OEMs. Urban air mobility is definitely a very interesting subject. It's something that probably has become an icon of the future of post-modernity. And we love to poke people's imagination by talking about flying cars, moving through our cities, going through buildings, servicing people's lives on a daily basis. And as fantastic as that is, and of course, as that poses the future towards where we want to go, in this nascent industry of urban air mobility and advanced air mobility in general, we do have to convey the correct message. And part of that correct message is graduality, how gradual we need to implement our systems, how this is not going to happen all at once, but rather in a very paced way in which we need to walk a learning curve, where we need to acquire know-how. And you may have heard us talk about things like the crawl, walk, run approach, and that refers to that graduality. There's not much consensus about what exactly those phases mean in practice. Many people have different views on that. And there's also not much consensus about the time, when exactly those phases will happen. But certainly it's something that poses, and are questions that are out there. And that's what's exciting, because we are building urban air mobility right now. And within that, one of the most important questions is, how do we start? Where do we start? How do we play this game, and how do we plan for that? And in Varon Vehicles, we have found that an ecosystem in Latin America brings a lot of value to that, because it offers a way to make it simpler. And simpler means faster, simpler means less costs as well, and it means less requirements, less stringent requirements for the systems. So that is the subject of our conversation today, how that means a certain value to air vehicle OEMs and, of course, the related subsystems. Hello, everybody. My name is Felipe Varon. I am the founder and CEO of Varon Vehicles, a disruptive infrastructure company. And I'm really glad to have a great panel today with us, not only because of the qualifications of each in their specific area, but because we have a diverse panel. And that's how we like to play our think tanks. I want to start by introducing David Rottblatt. He's the Business Development Director for Embraer X. He's a commercial fixed-wing pilot, helicopter pilot, and drone pilot. And he's the leader of Embraer X's Urban Air Traffic Management Project. Jia Xu, he's the Senior Director of Strategy for Unmanned Aerial Systems and Urban Air Mobility at Honeywell Aerospace, developing new products and serving as a systems integrator for both airframe makers and operators in this fast evolving market. Jia worked as a chief architect for urban air mobility systems at Airbus A3. He also held research and leadership positions at the RAND Corporation, where he led advanced technology programs in AI, machine learning, unmanned aerial systems, and autonomy, and worked on UAS design and engineering at General Atomics. Joining us as well is Colleen Reiche. Dr. Colleen Reiche leads the aviation business at Quantitative Scientific Solutions, a technical consulting firm headquartered in Arlington, Virginia, as a lead scientist, where her work focuses on data analytics, aviation weather research, stakeholder engagement, and evaluation of the urban air mobility landscape and challenges for a variety of federal and commercial clients. Mikhail Klassen from Paladin AI. Dr. Klassen is the Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of Paladin AI, a technology startup developing adaptive pilot training solutions using artificial intelligence. Brian Duncan, electrical engineer and MBA, he's Director, Strategic Campaigns and Business Development at Bell Flight. Has over 20 years of experience in product and project management, quality, manufacturing, sales, marketing, business development, strategy, across different markets, which include semiconductors, electric and hybrid ground vehicles, and defense and aerospace. Joining us as well is Andres Bejarano, the head of investor relations at Varon Vehicles. So welcome, guys. Great to have you here. And let's get the conversation started around that point, which is what sort of value we see from your points and your perspectives in terms of being air vehicle developers, OEMs, and eventual providers of our fleets of air vehicles in an ecosystem where we find the entire implementation of urban air mobility to be able to be simpler with lower requirements because of the shorter distances, because of the lower altitudes that we intend to fly in, which in Latin America allows there to be a value added for the mobility problem. So why don't we get started with David? Let's go in the same order of introduction. David, over to you.
Thanks, Felipe. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for joining us. So Embraer X is very much dedicated to being an ecosystem partner. We're obviously very excited about contributing a vehicle to the urban air mobility ecosystem as we're a partner to the Uber Elevate platform, as well as developing what we call urban air traffic management, a new paradigm for managing dense, low altitude airspace for the urban air mobility industry. There's a lot, I think, that we can learn with respect to viewing urban air mobility in the lens of Latin American cities and the value proposition that we hope to build for Latin American economies. Considering just for a moment the human geography of Latin America and how many people are really condensed into smaller areas in cities like Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, Bogota, there's a lot that we can learn with so many people that live in such a concentrated area, thinking about some of the shared types of pain points that we all feel, which is traffic, and therefore the value proposition would be time savings, the need to find a safe and reliable form to get to work. As well as thinking about the next generation of environmental concerns, which is greener air, more sustainable forms of transportation. And ironically, this is perhaps a side benefit of the COVID pandemic, is it's really created a pause for us to really think about how we can accelerate some of these other forms of greener, more sustainable forms of transportation as conventional forms of transportation have been throttled back a little bit. So when I look at Latin America and I see how much we can learn, I think that there's a lot to gain from looking at the experience that the VOOM product had in Sao Paulo and Mexico City, for example, or that Ubercopter had in cities like Dubai, where we started with conventional forms of transportation that seeks to build on top of the existing infrastructure and procedures that have already been around for many years, that has allowed urban air mobility to achieve its level of maturity that we're at today. Now we're just simply talking about the next chapter of what I think is a very exciting and successful story, but one that really seeks to bring a new level of accessibility and affordability to a broader swath of the population, if we can really embrace and understand what urban air mobility is really about. So those are my opening comments, and I look forward to sharing how we can potentially work with communities to make sure that that value proposition is understood and how we can really create that partnership that aviation would truly benefit from.
That's really great, David, and I appreciate that very much. I want to leverage on one of the points you touched, passing it over to Jia from Honeywell, in terms of the already existing infrastructure and how that also brings an added value to subsystems providers like yours, like Honeywell, where you're talking about powertrains, flight computers, aerospace integration systems, and many of the technologies can already leverage on existing infrastructure for MRO, for example, which means sustaining the fleets to, moving forward toward the future. Of course, keeping in mind that urban mobility air vehicles are going to probably be way, way simpler than the traditional aircraft, helicopters, and airplanes. Over to you, Gia.
Yeah, thank you, Felipe, and it's really a pleasure to be here, to be joined by this amazing panel to talk about this very timely subject in UAM and AAM. Honeywell has a vision, and that vision is that in the future, air cargo will arrive, at your door from a warehouse seamlessly across an autonomous logistics chain. We also see that urban air mobility will be pervasive and proliferated, such that you can go hop on an airplane close to where you live, you get to where you need to be, fly over traffic with minimum amount of fuss, and to do this with a high level of safety assurance. So to realize that vision, Honeywell stood up a new business unit focused on UAM, autonomy, and AAM, in the past few months. But we have been working on component technologies, including on compact fly-by-wire systems for many years now, dedicated to this particular market. So very excited to work with all of our vehicle partners to bring this vision to reality. I think I share your vision, Felipe, and what David has said, that we need that early market validation of the UAM promise, right? In Latin America, among other places, is really an amazing place to do this because of the existing heliport infrastructure that's in place, the comfort that people have with the existing helifleet business model, and the empirical test cases that was pioneered by VOOM, for example, on the ground. So I'm very buoyed by those prospects, as we do need continued proof cases and incremental advances in this domain to sustain investment and sustain efforts. From a component and system integrator perspective, timing is extremely important, because by the time an OEM wants to come to us, our systems have to be pretty far along so that we can support their mission and make sure that their system will meet the timeline that they've set out. So that's why I think being in forums like this and collaborating with the teams here is extremely important to get that early socialization of the ecosystem. And I'm really glad that you're pushing this effort at Varon.
Great. Before throwing the ball to Colleen, I wanted to add maybe to hear your comments and the following ones around a few added points. We want to go into the weather part in just a bit, Colleen, and of course that is your specialty, and we want to really hear about what advantages we see in a part of the world where weather availability is an added value. Now, into talking about the COVID situation, let me throw that out onto the table. There's a lot of talk and a lot of questions about how the reduced budgets today. You've mentioned VOOM, for example, Airbus's VOOM. Well, they had to shut down, unfortunately. And there's many other cases where the reality of the COVID situation is impacting today's budget. And how does that reflect actually into a value where we have an ecosystem where costs are actually a fraction of what they are in the developed world? And into that, I also want to throw in the problem of having a longer route towards implementation. If we have simpler approaches, and if we can take, for example, NASA's CONOPS, the Next Gen 1.0 version, which sort of sheds light into that roadmap of implementation. If we could take that and implement it in a very simplistic manner, how does that bring value to actually getting started, to that question of where do we start and how do we move forward? So over to you, Colleen.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Felipe, and thank you so much for this opportunity. This is a fantastic panel to be part of. So I think from the weather perspective, as you touched on, this crawl, walk, run concept is really critical, not only for all of the other elements that we talked about, but specifically for the weather. So essentially, weather is going to impact really many components, if not all of the components of the overall UAM ecosystem. So it's going to be really critical for some of the initial test cases, the initial demonstrations, and some of the initial lower scaled operations to be conducted in sort of fair weather locations and in situations. Prior to joining QS2, I led a UAM market study for NASA ARMD, and essentially as part of that, we did a quantitative assessment of historical weather conditions in 10 US cities. And essentially we're looking at what the potential impacts just due to weather could be on UAM operations. And we found that in many of these US cities, weather could potentially disrupt operations for more than half of the operational day. And that includes all types of weather phenomena. And that study was only looking at surface weather. And as I'm sure all can recognize, winds aloft can also be, a major concern as well. So that analysis really underscored the need for focusing some of these early efforts on locations where there is minimal adverse weather, mostly clear skies, minimal thunderstorms, minimal snow, icing, those types of things, exactly what we would find in Latin America. So I think for that reason, some of that crawl, walk, types of phases from a weather perspective would be very well suited in that location.
Great. Let's pass it over to Mikhail.
Sure. Thank you, Felipe. Great to be part of this panel. Just to sort of comment on what Colleen was just saying, I mean, if you look at like where a lot of the flight schools are located, you know, like think about Florida, think about Spain, like these are these like fair weather climates that are ideal for training pilots year round. And my company, Paladin AI, is concerned about the issues involved in pilot training. I mean, we saw in civil aviation an enormous shortage of qualified pilots, and then COVID happened. So now all of these pilots, or many of them, were furloughed. Some of them are going to choose to retire early. Some of them are going to look for other work and then decide they're not going to turn to aviation when the industry picks up again in 2 or 3 years. And so the shortage that was bad before is going to be even worse when aviation recovers. And how do you create learning environments that can bring down the cost of training, that can accelerate a pilot from 0 to, you know, first officer, and do that as effectively as possible? What we're doing at Paladin AI is creating machine learning software that interfaces with the training devices and provides instructors tools to automate as much of that training process as possible and to get competency metrics for that pilot. So what a lot of people in the UAM market haven't said very much about is, you know, where are the pilots going to come from, the operators for all of these aircraft? What is the training infrastructure going to look like? And we've started to have conversations with some of these vehicle OEMs and talking to them about what they imagine their training solutions are going to look like. Who is going to supply the flight simulators? What is the level of fidelity that those simulators need to have? Is it going to be a full flight simulator? Those are very expensive. Do we need to train on full flight simulators to get that level of proficiency? Or can we do a lot more on just lower level devices, panel trainers, fixed base simulators? And then how do you qualify a pilot then, you know, to be ready to fly one of these, let's say an air taxi? We'd like to see analytics used in that process to be able to objectively qualify that pilot so that they can enter into this burgeoning new market that's going to supply many new jobs in Latin America, and create a whole new ecosystem, a whole new market that's going to be very exciting. And I think all this is happening much faster than people appreciate.
Yeah, absolutely, Mikhail. Very, very important point, because the operators of our air vehicles are definitely not going to be the traditional pilots with all the costs and training involved, but they're not going to be truck drivers either. They need to be a very specific new type of operator, where the responsibility and the burden level, of course, matches the capabilities of automation and the types of aircraft, the nature of these aircraft that we're talking about, eVTOLs. So, and we do see a lot of value in Latin America's, offer for job positions in those terms as well. Over to you, Brian, please.
Well, Felipe and everybody, thank you very much for the opportunity. I've just been kind of taking notes because great minds think alike. So a lot of the points that I had were discussed by the panel, which is great. So I'll just add a couple of things and kind of tie some of these questions together as you guys were going. So thank you all for your feedback. At Bell, we've been innovating for 85 years, making things fly. From the X-1 jet, the first airplane or jet to break the sound barrier, to helping NASA with jet packs and really, really cool things, right? But one of the things in Latin America that I would want to start with and to emphasize what the panel has said is, it's as an OEM from the United States, right? Working with the FAA and NASA and others, right? That help enable that technology is amazing. But we're also seeing with Latin America as a path of least resistance, right? While we work with the FAA and the powers to be, which will always be the case, right? When we certify an aircraft, once you certify with the FAA, it'll make it much easier to homologate that technology throughout the world. I think where an ecosystem or a solution like Varon Vehicles is actually providing, right, and offering is that path of least resistance, right? Also, you know, having spent a lot of my time growing up in Latin America, I spent a lot of time in Colombia, but I also lived in Brazil, lived in Argentina, and spent a lot of time in Mexico, which I also love. And the typical congestion, right, that David was talking about and others you know, when I lived in Sao Paulo, I was working for Motorola at the time, and if we had a VIP come in, the only way to really have 2 or 3 meetings in one day was, you know, you had to go to a heliport in that hotel and you know, hail a cab, right, with a conventional helicopter, whether it was a Bell or not, right? It's irrespective of the conversation, but it cost a lot of money, and only a very few people had access, right? Where you could shave 3 to 4 hours, you know, in Sao Paulo, right? From east to west or north to south, right? The only way to get to those meetings was through the air. But one of the beautiful things that I see here, and everybody's in accordance, right, is the accessibility, right? We're not making this for the VIPs anymore only, right? This is gonna be accessible to the masses, right? And that's where we're gonna head. It may be a service where only few are gonna have access to it, as, you know, the economies of scale, but really our endpoint is having the typical Colombian, the typical Mexican, the typical Russian, wherever it is that these vehicles are gonna be in emerging markets such as Colombia, you know, how do we benefit everybody, right? And how do we give people back time, right? And how do we measure that, right? Can we spend more time with our kids? Can we spend more time, you know, doing whatever it is that we want to do? The other thing I want to add is the labor rates in Colombia, in this case, you know, they're going to be much lower than in other parts or in Latin America, right? Lower than other parts of the world, but also, most importantly, very capable talent, right? We have people that are doctors, and people that have PhDs in Latin America that unfortunately, due to the socioeconomic developments, are riding a cab, right? They're a taxi driver or a bus driver. Nothing wrong with that, but having capable talent and putting them to good use, right? That's how you advance society. So I think there's a lot in that in Latin America. And also with regards to talent on the, that Mikhail mentioned, right? Where do we get the pilots, right? My dad's a pilot, fixed wing, right? I leave that to the experts because you don't want me flying something, but I'll tell you, we pay them a lot, right? And it's great, right? They're certified, they have a very specific mission, but where are we getting the talents, right? It's for UAVs, it's a very different talent pool, right? Gaming conventions, right? These guys that are going in with Xboxes and they grew up with that, like we probably all grew up with Nintendos, right, or Ataris. But these people are going in with those same control modules, right? And even when I was selling defense articles and UAVs of that sort, the same Xbox and PlayStation controls are simulated, right? Because it's a very completely different shift from a conventional pilots that we have some here, like Felipe and David, that you have to study a lot. You have to pay a lot, right, in order to get those certifications. With automation, that's going to change, right, and it's going to continue to change that talent pool, which will be less expensive when it comes, but that's good because it'll trickle down to the end customer who's paying for this air taxi service, right? All that trickles down to lower operating costs in general, or DOC, but also at the end of the day, if we make it available to the masses, right, which is where we want to go, it all trickles down better and much cheaper if we do it in Latin America, let's say in Colombia, versus doing it in the US or Europe.
Those are great points, and I want to throw the ball out to everybody for that. Before I do that, let me just remind our attendees that you guys can ask your questions down below in the questions and answers button. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible between all panelists. And as well, the language of this think tank is English, but you can go down to the interpretation button you see right now in your window and choose to hear this think tank in Spanish, live interpreted if you wish. So going back, let me throw out the ball to whoever wants to comment on those very, very important points.
Actually, the simplified vehicle operations, is something that everybody kind of alluded to as the elephant in the room, right? We have to, to achieve the kind of scale that we're envisioning, we really need to broaden and expand the pilot pool. And I think it's something that is extremely important. It's also a pathway to injecting additional levels of autonomy into the system, to have this graduated pattern where you can get system being operation and add additional levels of autonomy as the systems evolve. So at Honeywell, we have this vision for really implementing simplified vehicle operation and reinterpreting the control paradigm, right? Because there's going to be elements of traditional pilotship in that equation, but we potentially also have to draw inspiration from other control paradigms. So I like when Brian said the idea of Nintendos and all of that. Some of those ideas are not entirely from a different world, right? Because the operators of the future may take human-machine interface and user experience cues from other domains. So it's a very exciting space to be in because of all the ideas that we can take in and integrate and bring into a certified product.
Felipe, I'd like to add, and I think it's important that the general public understand one potential way in which this industry may continue to unfold is that it's not just what we in industry would like to do or what we can do. We can do a lot of really cool stuff if we didn't have to also be concerned with the safety case and making sure that the regulators are happy and that legislators are happy. So I believe that while there's a lot of work being done by excellent organizations that work to get the best of different manufacturers, software, and technology providers like Gamma in the United States, or General Aviation Manufacturers Association, or AIA, which are working on things like simplified vehicle operations and what we can propose to legislators. Ultimately, I believe that in the beginning, there won't be a lot of eVTOL aircraft. We will start somewhat modestly and then scale from there. But in order to earn the trust of the regulators and the traveling public, I believe that it would be prudent to begin with a skilled pilot, probably from the manufacturer that built the aircraft to help launch this industry. There's a tremendous wealth of excellent aviation expertise out there from pilots of all walks of life, and we can certainly tap some of that. Naturally, this industry can't really scale to the level that we want it to without starting to explore semi-autonomous and autonomous operation, and I'm sure we will get there soon. But there also isn't any kind of legislative foundation for such an operation. And so we really need to work to create the data, make very strong data-driven arguments that will help a legislator see the value in evolving beyond the type of paradigm we have today towards semi-autonomous and fully autonomous operations, so that a new law can then empower a regulator to regulate such an environment. And I feel that is, I think, a very important road that lies in front of us. And it's not just navigating that ambiguous environment, but it's also working together to figure out what is the threshold that we ought to establish for ourselves to figure out how do we go from the type of very experienced pilot that we expect in the cockpit today towards a more simplified vehicle operation, which is perhaps not as experienced of a pilot, but still a pilot. And then slowly but surely, perhaps a safety pilot, someone that's just monitoring the aircraft, and then fully remote operations. And so it certainly is a road. And I think that while we are working to understand better how we can grandfather in some of the existing procedures and infrastructure that the conventional form of urban air mobility uses today, which are helicopter routes, TK routes, and the conventional form of VTOL aircraft, we can start to think about these types of procedures in parallel to see how do we establish for NASA, for ANAC in Brazil, for EASA, for the FAA, a process that industry feels comfortable with. And that's really what the FAA and NASA is doing today with the national campaign, which was called the Grand Challenge on behalf of NASA. There's a lot of work being done to really bring in some of these smartest and most experienced minds that industry has to offer to partner with NASA so that we can then offer those recommendations. to regulators around the world. So that's worth bearing in mind, that there certainly is a road, and I think we're all clearly very dedicated to making sure that we can navigate that ambiguous environment together.
That's a good point. And Felipe, if I may have a minute to add to what David is saying, because he's spot on. You know, there's a lot of things that we're doing at Bell as well with our Bell Nexus. And one of the things that David actually mentioned is, you know, our autonomous air taxi is going to be autonomous, right, from the get-go. But in order for that customer acceptance to happen, we're going to start with a safety pilot, right? Somebody that way people feel, hey, I'm not going to be a guinea pig. I'm not going to get on that thing, be the first one there. You know, there's going to be that added peace of mind that David was alluding to, right? And it's that it helps us with the crawl, walk, run approach, right? Also, I wanted to mention that some of the things that not only that Bell is doing, but the industry is doing as a whole is we just participated in what's called NASA SIO demonstration. So basically we took another of our family of drones called the Autonomous Pod Transport. It's a logistics drone, but all that to say that we work with NASA and the FAA, and we were able to fly a medical mission in Class Bravo, right? Class B airspace in Dallas-Fort Worth. And working with NASA as the technology enabler and the FAA as the regulator, you know, we collected a lot of data, right? And even we had CASA and others that helped us collect weather as well. Like Colleen, you know, is the expert on this and probably heard of some of these folks as well, or work with them, is the more we do as an industry and all the people that are here on this panel, the more we do things together to push, you know, the boundaries of what exists here in the US will make it much easier, right? Eventually to do it elsewhere, like in Colombia or Latin America, where those regulations are not yet written either, but it's much easier, right? And much simpler to do these things in parallel, like what Varon Vehicles is proposing to all of us. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think if I can just jump in and kind of dovetail on that, Brian and David, fantastic points. And I think one other element from the weather angle in terms of paradigm shifts, in terms of regulations, at least within the United States and internationally, you know, there are standards and sort of blessed weather sources. And the current sort of paradigm for that is to certify weather sensors. And there's a lot of activity going on. NASA has some community integration working group focused on weather, and we actually just talked about this last week, is we really need to have a paradigm shift from focusing on certifying specific sensors to certifying data to really get us into, you know, it doesn't really matter necessarily what the data is being collected from, but it needs to be, the data itself needs to be certified and then, you know, being able to be used. So that's another area I think where, you know, some of this kind of pushing the envelope, Brian, as you mentioned, we're looking to do that in the aviation weather community as well, to try to ignite some of these paradigm shifts that can, you know, further cascade. And I think Latin America can certainly be an initial test bed for that.
Great points, guys. I think these are very, very critical points, especially at this time when we are designing urban air mobility, when we're developing this entire idea and actually starting implementation efforts. And that's what we're doing about vehicles. We're leading this ecosystem, planning for first integrated operations of systems, including aircraft, in an urban air mobility ecosystem to get started. And that's where all these points that David and Brian and now Colleen have touched lately in the conversation come into play in reality. It's the fact that we can leverage on opportunities we're seeing in Latin America, and especially in countries like Colombia, the opportunities to implement in a much simpler way. And that means a lot, not only because what we said at the beginning, the requirements for the systems are much lower, but we can also have an ecosystem where we can start certification processes. And let's talk about that. I want to throw that out to all of you guys, be it on the weather side or on the air vehicle or the subsystems or pilot training. What sort of value do we see in the fact that we can have a faster implementation because of the support from the government and their recognition of an existing endemic mobility problem in Latin America, in countries like Colombia, where there's a tremendous pressure to find solutions to the lack of mobility infrastructure. How do we see that of value in terms of being able to start gathering that data faster, in terms of being able to gather that data at a much reduced cost, and in terms of being able to do it now? So who wants to jump into any of those points?
I can jump in. So, on your point of collecting this data, I mean, data is core to aviation. It's one of the most data intensive industries on the planet. But I think only more recently have we started to think about, well, let's take this data and we'll use it, we'll go to the regulators and use data to push new regulation. And this is what we're trying to do in pilot training. In our conversations with the FAA and other regulators, they have always, they've been actually much more open-minded than we expected them to be. And they've always said, come to us with data, like show us that these new ways of approaching these solutions that are data-driven, present us with the evidence and the regulations will follow. Now, with the urban air mobility space, I think it's going to be similar. There's a lot of rulemaking groups that have already formed that are trying to figure out how to manage airspace, how to certify aircraft. All of this is proceeding at a fast clip. So let's start the process at the beginning, being very data driven. And if I could just maybe address one of the questions in the Q&A section, there was a question relating to training from Michael Syracuse. It's going to start with the aircraft OEMs. They're the ones that built the airframes, that they'll be supplying the flight model in the same way that Airbus and Boeing supply the flight models to the simulator OEMs. It'll be Joby or Lilium or Embraer supplying flight models to the simulator OEMs so that we can do data-driven training for urban air mobility.
Great. Anybody want to jump in, comment on any of these?
So I can jump in sort of from a weather perspective, I think, circling back, Felipe, to your original question. So I think one of the critical needs in terms of kind of trying to fast track things, at least from the weather perspective, is for having a dedicated weather test bed or really an opportunity to focus on how can we address some of the existing weather gaps, as well as test sensing of weather information directly from the vehicles and sort of how that would work in terms of communicating to other vehicles, reporting to the ground, et cetera. And Brian briefly mentioned, I am aware there's quite a bit of work going on in North Central Texas with some test bed activities, which are a fantastic first step. But I think in order to extend that into kind of getting out of some of these standards and certification stronghold, essentially, that can happen, I think there could be opportunities in Latin America if there are ways to get rid of a little bit of that red tape and really allow us to further explore not only how are we going to sense and collect this data and start to address some of these gaps, but also how can we move forward with certifying the actual data and creating standards around the data rather than the actual sensors, kind of using that as a test case or a test bed that we can then use in other countries to again kind of ignite that paradigm shift and help address some of these weather gaps that we know exist and will exist.
When I was
go ahead, David.
Thanks, Felipe. I was a very happy customer of the VOOM service in Sao Paulo for over a year every time I would go to Brazil. And I noticed that the type of go, no go decisions and the tools that I had to make those decisions in the United States are very different than what they had in Brazil. And that speaks to the variation in technology and the resources that pilots and operators and aircraft have country to country, which is usually a product of variation in standards that regulators have for that environment. Those pilots really just had a very minimal amount of avionics on board their aircraft and a cell phone that they used to call the destination heliport when I was flying to Guarulhos from downtown Sao Paulo to say, hey, what's the weather like over there? And that was the destination heliport. That's like, I don't know, 20 miles, 20 kilometers away from where we were taking off. But because there are so many microclimates in cities like Sao Paulo or in Bogota, Mexico City, Panama City, you need to know, even within that short distance, how things can vary. Even throughout your flight, things can change. And so we need to make sure that we're also equipping pilots and operators with the proper technology and weather-related tools to help make those go-no-go decisions beyond just calling ahead and saying, hey, what's it like right now? And that's literally what happened with me. We ended up hanging out in the lobby for a while until the flight was safe, even though it was nighttime. You could still fly VFR at night, but the weather was very iffy. And those thunderstorms in Sao Paulo can sometimes come like right on schedule, like clockwork at 3 p.m. every day during some particular months of the year. And so a lot, I think, can be done and should be done to think about how we can properly update the minimum equipment list for these types of flights if they are going to be VFR, therefore not receiving air traffic control services because priority is given to IFR flights. The pilot is really left to himself or herself to make these types of decisions and to safely navigate not only around the weather or through the weather, but also detecting and avoiding, sensing and avoiding other aircraft in that airspace. And so today, all you need to enter controlled airspace, like Bravo airspace in the United States, for example, is a two-way transponder, verbal authorization to enter that airspace, and a two-way radio, and that's it. That's a far cry from what I think vehicles and operators and pilots ought to have if they're going to be really flying solo in VFR airspace only. So there's certainly progress to be made there, but I think industry is aware of the fact that there is a lot of variation in technology and tools and resources that are available country by country. And if we can start advocating for reducing that variation and creating more of a level playing field, so that the type of data that we collect is more universal around the world, I think that would be a huge step forward.
I'll add Felipe real quick to that. It's a great segue to communications, right? And the importance of that in the airspace. And I think something that we need to pay closer attention to will be the 5G connectivity and how it's embedded into the ecosystem, right? Of UTM in general, that I know it's one of the topics that we're here to talk about, but also the difference between US 5G and Chinese 5G, right? And as David is saying, and others, we need to have these systems really not only connect, but also talk to each other, detect and avoid each other, right? These air vehicles will have the same, if not more, right? Things to avoid, not only themselves, but the same bird strikes or other things that conventional aircraft, need to stay away from. So it's gonna be interesting the more we all work together, but there's gonna be some limitations as to how can we make it universal, right? Like we have in conventional planes and rotorcraft today, but with UAVs having our own corridors, right? Our own frequencies, but hopefully those frequencies do mesh, right? And are able to communicate from point A, to point B that may be a couple of 100 feet and how to avoid it. So maybe that's a topic for another discussion, but something that I wanted to throw out there because I think we all want to see how we can integrate and make sure whether it's an Embraer or it's a Bell or it's an Airbus, or whatever it is, that it communicates well, right? And that we can deconflict the airspace. And if these technologies are not going to be able to communicate, right, between a US and a Chinese 5G, for example, that's going to pose other issues and other headaches that we need to start thinking about now. Thanks.
Great. Before we move on, Jia, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, really very interesting points. I think there are a couple points that's interesting here. One is this idea of standards, which it would be wonderful if we have, common standards on UAM, common standards on communication around the world. But one of the one of the things that we're seeing is that some of the UAM development is becoming more siloed, with FAA and EASA potentially going on different directions, another country kind of lining up in those camps, and CAAC is also considering potentially different approaches. So that's kind of a reflection of the world that we live in today. And as system makers, we're very cognizant of this perspective. And especially as we want to plan ahead and drive towards standards, and we are doing that, we also see this need to be flexible and adapt, right? If you're going to build a multi-mode communication system and have that be robust so that you can offload and onboard the kind of hyperlocal weather data that David is alluding to, then that system will have to have the modularity and abstraction to be able to cope with different communication standards, and maybe even, and in fact, most certainly dynamically take on multimodal features so that we have assured connectivity. So that's one aspect of it. I think we all come into this world and into this ecosystem with some measure of flexibility in mind, because the ecosystem and the urban environment that they reside in are both evolving very rapidly.
Great. We already have had a few questions come in, but they've mostly been answered by either live or written in a written form already. So guys, if you want our attendees to, you want to submit any questions, please send them now over the questions and answers button on the bottom of your screen. And I want to throw out a last couple of conversation points. And first, it's weather. And probably Colleen can give us a much more accurate view into whether there's a value in there being more weather availability for urban air mobility air vehicle operations in a part of the world where we don't have seasons, where we don't have that changing in weather in a constant basis, but rather we have a very continuous weather all year round, and how that can impact being able to do it faster, to gather that data faster. And the second point to any of you and all of you is the existing Colombia-United States relationship, the existing relationship between the Colombian CAA and the FAA. How us as urban air mobility and the air vehicle OEMs and the subsystems providers being able to operate in an ecosystem in Colombia can use that, all that data, all that know-how back in the experience and know-how in the certification processes that are being projected to be run in the United States under the FAA. How can Colombia be an extension of the United States in those regards? And that, I think that's a very relevant point as we strive to move forward and implement urban air mobility here first. So anybody want to jump into any of those two?
Felipe, real quick on the Colombia-US, I would say partnership, right? Not only, and that's something that you know, I've lived on the commercial and on the defense side, and working with our, you know, as a US citizen, but also Colombian, working on both sides and helping helping that relationship. Colombia has a very unique position compared to any other country in Latin America. It's the US, or Uncle Sam, right, as they call him. It's really the father, right, or the older brother of Colombia, right? Militarily speaking, it's the #1 ally in the hemisphere for the US. Thanks to the good partnership militarily, right, of government to government. Colombia is now an aggregate member of NATO, which is the only country that's been able to do that on this side of the pond. The US has not only given equipment, right, and trained the Colombian armed forces to counter a lot of you know, terrorism and counter drugs and a lot of things, but joint missions, training, you know, platform commonality, you name it. But how, a lot of people may be wondering, how does that fit into the commercial space? But it has a lot of, all those government to government relations that are so tight does actually transfer onto the commercial side, where the FAA, NASA, and others know how to work with Colombia, have been working with Colombia, whether directly or indirectly. And the MRO structure, you know, for helicopters is there already because of that platform commonality between our governments. Some of the helicopters that are there are really commercial in nature, but are militarized or go into these para-public or paramilitary, I would say, missions, right? So all of that there puts Colombia in a very unique position that quite honestly, or quite frankly, no other country in the region has with the US. So it puts not only Varon vehicles, but Colombia as an epicenter, right, of, you know, the largest economies, right, between Mexico and Brazil, right? Colombia is the epicenter. Even on the location, it's a perfect fit for these US-Colombia partnerships on the commercial and military side. And that's what I wanted to kind of set the pace for the people, not only on the panel, but also for the people that are at their homes looking at, hey, why Colombia? Well, there's a beautiful, you know, history there between our two countries, and one that we should definitely leverage, right? Thanks.
Great. Anybody else want to comment on that? Probably Colleen, can you give us a perspective on the weather availability part?
Sure, I can jump in on that. So I think from that perspective, I think as I mentioned before, you know, there's a lot of questions that need to be answered in terms of UAM weather from a broader perspective. We touched on a few of them today, but I think starting in a location where you have relatively consistent and relatively predictable weather, you know, mostly fair weather as we're referring to it, will allow for a strong foundation and an opportunity to test and develop some of the new sensing methods, evaluate new weather products that might be higher spatial and temporal resolution, can allow us to test communications, you know, weather information, vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to ground, some of the availability of weather to the pilots that David touched on. You know, so how do we collect that data? How do we make it available to the pilots and the operators? So as we start to answer some of those questions and test some of those questions, doing that in a relatively predictable, consistent type of climate, I think would be the best foundation. And then once we get that baseline, we can then start to layer in a little bit more complexity from a weather perspective and a little less predictability. And also, I just want to comment, I saw a note from Don Virchow in the chat and I think this is something that we should explore, not only on this panel, but moving forward, that I mentioned before some of the activities going on in the United States around weather standards. And as Don referenced, we have several working groups focused on UAS weather standards and specifically looking at that paradigm shift from developing standards focused on sensors to the actual data. And I think welcoming some of the panelists here, as well as representatives from Colombia and other areas of Latin America, to be part of that group would be incredibly valuable to help kind of unite that discussion around how can we ignite some of these paradigm shifts that will be needed to enable and address some of these issues with UAM weather.
Yeah, I think the added effect is to bring some amount of certainty and also alleviate the burdens on the OEM side, right? Because some of the weather, when you look at the cross section of all the weather phenomena in terms of aloft wind, which really may eat into your range and reserves, if you consider icing and other weatherization requirement that may lead to a heavier vehicle, these will all kind of slow down the initial adoption, right? Given the kind of battery, electric, and EPU kind of limitations that we have today, and so. Operating in benign environments or you know, finding enough benign weather environments to operate in, I think really reduces some of the challenges on the vehicle design side as well in a much more fundamental way.
Great. Anybody else want to? We already have answered all the questions from our attendees, either written or live. So who wants to make a comment? We have just 5 minutes remaining on our panel. So why don't we give it a perspective, Mikhail, from the operators, you know, the pool of people available, what type of people are we expecting that to be, the operators, the type of salary level probably, can we have a mention on that? We do see a lot of potential in the Colombian market for that type of labor. Why don't we hear from you from the training perspective?
Sure. Well, I mean, consider the pathway to become a commercial pilot in the United States. You sometimes have people just coming out of high school and then going into a college where they will be receiving a general education as well, but with a focus on training to become a pilot. And sometimes they'll get university degrees before becoming pilots, but there are faster pathways. There's also the pathway that goes through the military, right? You leave high school and you get Air Force trained, and those are some of the best pilots in the world. So starting on the training of the next generation of operators for urban air mobility, are we going to demand university degrees? That seems, unnecessary to me. But we can probably set up the right kinds of training centers and training environments, or a novel kind of flight school that will take somebody with a high school level of education and train them up to be, as you say, like, it's not like driving a truck, but it's also not going to be like, the $200,000 salaried, 747 pilot, right? It's going to be somewhere in between. And there's going to be the initial population of pilots, which are going to come from the commercial world that are already highly trained, highly skilled, and they will establish what the norms for future pilots are going to be. And then we can use that as the basis and then train up and build the training infrastructure to get them to that same level.
Great. How about Jia, from the perspective of the subsystems? There's already existing infrastructure, labs and certification, know-how and infrastructure and locations in Colombia, actually, for many subsystems providers for traditional aircraft that are able to be used in urban air mobility aircraft, this new generation of air vehicles. So what's your perspective in terms of that, and mixed with the capabilities that those new aircraft need to have for those pilots or those operators that Mikhail and we've been talking about, to be able to operate the vehicles while being much lower trained type of personnel? What's your perspective from the subsystems part of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two aspects of that. Honeywell actually has a extensive Latin America presence, right? Both on the MRO side and the research and development side. We have the company here is, we're a local company, right? If we're in Mexico, if we're in Colombia, then we want to be considered a local company, right? And so that really helps us position to understand the market, but also build the kind of system that would make sense there for the early adapter. So I think that's, on that side of things, there are advantages to have an international presence, for sure. On the other hand, I think with respect to the simplified vehicle operations and who's that first operator, I think there's a lot of good thinking that needs to go into that, because it's not a trivial question, right, of how you build the avionics such that you have basically very high level of safety envelope protection, right, that you allow the pilot to really be more the engine for decision, right, to be in the loop at times, but mostly on the loop, be able to monitor, be able to make strategic choices in this much more complex operating environment with the aid of a lot of offboard data and high assurance onboard sensors. So I think at Honeywell, we're taking a very systematic approach to that, right? There's our concentrated effort at developing the next generation of simplified vehicle operation systems. We also, obviously, as I think David and Brian, who are in the thick of building these aircraft, alluded to, we are also building a system that will enable initial Part 23 type operations in a miniaturized form factor. So we see this progression, but we definitely have this SVO vision in sight. And because we can take a very systematic approach to it, reconsider the human interface, the HMI, have the kind of interaction with training entities and stakeholders and regulatory stakeholders to make sure that we satisfy those requirements. Mikhail, we should talk about that. I think that it's how we think about SVO, we really want the input of the training community as well. And finally, that's all integrated in the Honeywell case with our fly-by-wire systems, with our sensor suite, and with our detect and avoid solution, so that we can really optimize the whole system to deliver safety and value.
Great. So Andres, let me give it over to you. We have a remaining question there. Let's try to answer that really fast. Over to you. Please unmute your microphone.
Okay, thank you, Felipe. I'm gonna read the last question that was unanswered, and is made by Oscar Rincon, who asks, how far on time do you see this type of mobility being implemented in LATAM? And do you see current MAAS apps integrating with this service? For
Right.
all the panelists,
Who wants to jump into that question? Overarching general question.
So if I may, I'll dive in, and then I'll excuse myself due to another call. But I'll say that the most available and recent forms of urban air mobility have already come to Latin America. Sao Paulo is the world's largest market for air taxi operations, with upwards of 1,200 flights every day. And that's just in downtown Sao Paulo, let alone all the other cities that take advantage of that type of transportation and technology, including Rio, Curitiba. VOOM also had a very successful launch in Mexico City, where there is already a very healthy air taxi industry there as well. The question really becomes, how can we start to get enough of community demand in place such that manufacturers and operators, software and technology providers will want to bring the solution to your neighborhood, to your city, to your country? And so I imagine that there may be a few different nations represented on today's call. And so I think what we can do is to start having these conversations with local stakeholders in your cities and states and countries, get them excited about it, share with them what we've spoken about today. And there certainly are many different types of apps, software as a service apps, again, that are provided by technology and service providers that can be integrated. UTM today, which is really an evolving technology that has been successful at managing different types of drone operations, successfully works to integrate different types of capabilities and apps using standardized APIs, such that the end user, you or me, are able to take advantage of a broad swath of technology. And I think that the next generation of air traffic management for this industry will seek to do that very same thing. ForeFlight, I think, is a really great example of how we can combine software and hardware together, where you have ADS-B in and out capabilities coupled with a great program that provides a lot of great weather and decision-making capability, traffic avoidance, right on your iPhone or your iPad or any other kind of device that's compatible with that software. So I think a lot of work has already been done. The question just becomes, how do we get people excited and bring this to your community? And so everyone is working right now to I think become an early adopter. And if we can continue to have conversations like this, I'm sure that it'll catch the eye of all of the panelists here, as well as Embraer X to come. So thank you very much, Felipe.
Well, great. I thank you very much all. As always, this think tank has come to an end. And I really want to thank you all by doing a very short closing statement in regards to probably circling around Oscar's question. Yes, we're going to come to that time when urban air mobility is going to need to integrate with transportation network companies, TNCs, and mobility will become a seamless experience. That's from origin to destination, moving through different modes of transportation, be it shared vehicles, autonomous vehicles, urban air mobility vehicles, scooters, and walking. We need that to be a seamless experience. That's the type of solution that we in urban air mobility are trying to provide eventually to our cities. But that's a future far ahead. There's a lot of discussion of around when that will happen. And it's because of what we have talked in this panel. Urban air mobility, it's a gradual implementation. It's not going to happen all at once. There's a long learning curve that we all need to walk. As Brian has said repeatedly in this panel, we need to walk that path together. This is not about one company doing it all. It's about an ecosystem, a system of systems and conglomerates and working together to implement in general these mobility solutions that not only entail passenger transportation, that's probably the run phase as we see it in Varon vehicles. Prior to all those passenger transportation business cases like air taxis through TNC partners, like tourism applications, like patient transportation between hospitals, before all those happen, we think there's a high probability of a walk phase happening before, which entails freight transportation. By logic, we think that we're going to be moving and transporting boxes and packages before we transport people. And before that walk phase, we feel there's a crawl phase, something that comes even before all that. And then that's the first implementation that we are talking about. And that has been the question we've posed in this think tank. How do we start? Where do we get started? How do we find value in where we're starting? And that's where Latin America and Colombia in particular, in our case in Varon vehicles, comes into play a very important role, not only because of the organic advantages of Latin America in weather, in reduced labor, qualified labor costs, but also because of the recognition of governments and from aeronautics authorities of the endemic mobility problem and how they need to be instrumental in supporting urban air mobility. So with that, guys, I want to thank you all in our panel and our attendees for joining us in this very interesting think tank. And I invite you guys to come to our next one on the 14th of October, where we'll be talking about vertiports. It'll be our second think tank about vertiports. So see you then, and to all, have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Felipe.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you.